Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon. And today we have as our guest the former MEP, Director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. It is, of course, Mr. Stephen Wolfe. How are you doing, Stephen?
I'm very well, Nick. Thank you very much for inviting me on your show.
Well, thanks for doing it. I've got loads of questions. I don't know where to start, but I thought I'd go straight in with the big ones and ask this one because Farage and Reform are polling pretty well at the moment, and you have a fairly complicated history with Nigel Farage. So I just wondered how you felt about the prospect of Prime Minister Nigel Farage.
Okay, it's with mixed feelings, and I've made this very clear to people. I believe Nigel Farage has some good qualities and some very bad qualities. Amongst those good qualities, he reaches out to ordinary people. He has a capability of speaking incredibly well, and he's able to challenge the status quo. Those that some people would call the uni party, others just the normal parties, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats and Labour, and he's able to challenge that. And he's more importantly, he's able to engender a sense of community, what he calls the people power, bringing people together. And he's done so through UKIP. He did so for the Brexit Party, and he's now doing so very successfully through Reform. My problem with Nigel is that my sense with him, he doesn't necessarily always believe all the policy issues. He's naturally a Thatcherite conservative, low taxation. So when he says he wants to help those who have more than two children, or he wants to help pensioners, it's not his natural ground to move on to the left of politics. Secondly, he has an ability just to want to be himself. He has to be number one. And therefore, talent within his party, those who rise to the top, he removes quite successfully. Recent years, he's done so with Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe, but he's gone back all in his history to do that. And therefore, as a prime minister, will he be able to successfully have a team of individuals that are needed across different policy portfolios? And I think thirdly, my biggest concern is that he does deals for himself. He left UKIP when they had 3.5 million votes, having successfully won the European election, but then got 3.5 million votes in 2015. And then he just decided to leave. And we now know that was, in his words, to get his life back, but really it was to build a media career and get some money. Then in the Brexit Party, he persuaded hundreds of candidates to put money into the party and stand. Then he sold them out to do a deal with Boris. And now the question is, if he does become prime minister, is it for himself or will he sell lots of other people out along the way? And if he does so, my biggest concern is that that will be a devastating moment for the movement of individuals who want desperate change in this country away from the traditional parties.
All right, very interesting. So you sort of say that he's naturally a Thatcherite, but he also seems to kind of signal against the right constantly. So, I mean, there's the Thatcherite right, but anyone sort of maybe a bit further right than that. He constantly wants to say we're not part of them and we're not part of that lot, to use Richard Tice's phrase. Um, what is all that about? And where are Reform now on the political spectrum? Because they've gone to the left on some issues, as you sort of allude to there, like the winter fuel payment and the child benefit cap. I think Starmer now is like Enoch Starmer on the far right, and Reform are now the left. I'm getting very confused. Where do you see them on the spectrum?
Uh, I see them very much towards a centre left party, very much more in the European model of centre left politics, a little bit like the Italians, maybe, or along those of the German political parties, where they have some socialist and economically socialist views, but he tries to argue that he's conservative and to the right on taxation and immigration. I think to answer your first point is we're not one of them refers to working class white males who support people like Tommy Robinson, who want stronger deportation rules, want to close the borders, want to pursue a national inquiry on the Pakistani rape gangs. And he doesn't feel comfortable with that white male population, the working class. And that's why I say that he's good at being able to speak to the working class in the same way that Boris was, in the same way that Churchill and Thatcher was to a certain extent. But his background and his natural inclinations are not to understand the working class. And where it gets uncomfortable, where it clashes against his history and his upbringing, where it becomes really difficult in those instances which are really impacting the working class communities, he shies away. And you get Richard Tyson him saying, "We're not one of them, we're not them," as though they're some form of extremists. And that's the same language as the nastier side of the Labour Party or other political parties who look down upon the working class and their concerns. They're good if they're voting fodder, and they're fine if they're voting for us. But where there is a massive issue that impacts them, we're going to ignore them. And if they get too cocky, get too above their station, then we'll call them not one of us, they're one of them over there. They're extremists, they're racists, they're other things.
Mm. Although, as we record, just yesterday, Keir Starmer did a weird press conference in a glass factory where he started talking about glass and stuff and then pivoted to attacking Nigel Farage. It was really bizarre. But many of the questions there, even from the mainstream media, were about how come Farage is cutting through more with the working class than you. Your dad's a toolmaker. He's been to a posh school and been a city trader. So actually, so he seems to be polling still well with working class and with the red wall.
Yes. Now let's start with the Red Wall. The Red Wall have now grown absolutely anarchic. They are in a stage of uprising, and their method of uprising is politics, the vote. They won't vote for Labour. They won't vote for Conservative. They would have started off with UKIP. They began with the Brexit Party. They did so by leaving the European Union. And I believe that Farage's Reform Party is just the repository of that anger and that desire to just totally move away from ordinary politics. If it wasn't Nigel Farage and Reform and it was somebody else at the head that was reasonable and sensible, then they would be voting for them. So if Rupert Lowe, for example, was in charge, they'd still be voting for Reform irrespective of Nigel Farage. He does have cover, he does have popularity, that helps. But I believe that's the main reason. They've had enough. They were wanting somebody that really can win and challenge those political parties. Nigel, as I said, has some good and strong qualities, and that is the ability at least to engage with people. He can sit there with a pint and a cigarette and banter his jokes with people of the working class. No one for a minute would consider being able to sit down and have a laugh with Keir Starmer. I mean, I think if you needed your children to go to sleep and you wanted a lullaby whilst they're ill, you'd put Keir Starmer in the room and he'd be there whilst you're downstairs with Nigel Farage having a joke over what's happened on Love Island. Well, maybe not Love Island, but certainly one being in the jungle. And that's where he can work. At least his bonhomie, his clubability, as he likes to call himself, has that ability to cut through. But there's one other aspect that the left, the liberal left, or those that you say, how can Starmer not cut through when his dad was a tool maker? Notwithstanding many of the working class jokes of what they will say about a toolmaker and Keir Starmer, is that there have been many, many instances in our history where the working class recognize that there is an upper class element of people in this country who understand them better than the middle class, who don't look down upon them, who may have landed estates, but they're fixed into this land. They want the country to continue with a king and a queen and a justice system, and they're protecting the borders, and they believe that sort of individual exists. They recognize that there are some nasty people out there who will exploit the working class, but there is a history where upper class people, barons, royals, and that's why there's a love of the royal family, are in it with them to protect the nation and what it means to them. The queuing system, the fact that we're genial, the fact that we like to make fun of ourselves, the fact that we are kind and looking out upward to the world. That sort of people understand them, and they will help them and protect the institution of this nation. They don't feel that in terms of that small c conservatism that runs through. Remember what George Orwell said, in writing in England. He said that the socialist will never be able to understand the working class because they're fundamentally Fabian types,
Mm.
intellectual, communistic, believing of being able to control the working class, but they don't understand them. They'd not have dinner with them, but they hope that they'll vote for them.
Right. And Starmer certainly fits into that, as well as a Pabloite, as Peter Hitchens always points out, being a subset of Trotskyism and a former editor of Socialist Alternatives. I guess he's more in that. Although I know you weren't talking about him there, but he sort of, that's perhaps why they can't relate to him either. But you mentioned Rupert Lowe there, and as we record, he's apparently just met with Robert Jenrick. And it's quite complicated because a poll from Merlin Strategies shows that Rupert Lowe is actually more popular with the Red Wall than Jenrick. He has 6% and Jenrick's on 3%. So you go, hang on, should the Tories come to Rupert Lowe? But my question was going to be, will Lowe go to the Tories, and should he at this point?
I don't think Rupert Lowe will go towards the Conservative Party at all. And if you looked at that same polling, what was really fascinating is how young people, 11% of them, actually believed in Rupert Lowe. That was above Kemi Badenoch. And so Rupert Lowe, an individual MP, only for a short period of time, not with a big national political party behind him, although he did have that period of time with Reform, is polling extremely well, both with young people and across the country as a general position. And I think what Rupert will do is, having seen how Reform have looked upon him and dealt with him and pushed him out of that political party, I don't think he's willing to rush in to do a deal with the Conservative Party. I think he doesn't really trust the Conservative Party, whilst they have so many what some people would call casinos, conservative in name only, the Liberal Democrats, or within the Conservative Party. And until they learn their lessons, until they actually admit properly and understand why they failed, I think Rupert, just like Nigel, wants to see the end of that part of the Conservative Party. And so I'm of the view that I think Rupert will plough his own furrow with other people, maybe with Ben Habib, maybe with other people in the political spectrum who say, yeah, we're going to sit there and we're going to watch Nigel. If Nigel's implodes, if he starts to make big mistakes, if he moves away from the agenda of promising to the people and looks like he's going to fall away, we're going to be there with our own organization, whether that's a political party, whether that's a movement, whether it's a group of really caring individuals who want to do so. They're not going to go away from the field. They're going to be there waiting with structures in place. And I think he's already said that on X. He would do that. But I don't think he's ready to go to the Conservative Party. But if the Conservative Party fundamentally change, but remain with small numbers, and they do become a proper Conservative Party of the right, that's the only challenge to Farage. So that would make this kind of three-way system very interesting. They're not there yet, but I don't believe he'll go to Conservatives. I'm a much believer that he'll take the fight on as he is on his own with others.
All right, very interesting. And I mean, you're sort of no stranger to the problems with factionalism on the right, but would you be interested in getting involved with a Habib Lowe type vehicle?
If I was to be given a choice between two political parties or a political movement that was supporting the country as a whole, didn't ignore the working class, didn't ignore the damage that's being done economically to the middle classes in our country, understands that we need to have strong borders, strong criminal activity, looking at, sorry, not activity, but defense against criminal activity, and there were genuine and honest individuals who genuinely believed it for their own purposes, not for that of the country, but not for a financial purpose for themselves or simply becoming an MEP, then it would have to be with Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib rather than Nigel Farage. Because my belief in their characteristics and what I see are much more devoted to the nation and building the nation rather than their own political or individual careers. Of course, in all politics, there is a sense of ego without that, but I don't sense that in the same way that you do with many people who have connected to reform. At the top end, that's totally different to those who are on the streets working hard, knocking on doors, changing the message. And I believe that they're looking for a leader, and this will become interesting if he does go that way. I certainly, if I had to make a choice, that's who I would join.
Okay, and for those of us who follow this stuff professionally in some way or another, the Rupert Lowe thing seemed like a big deal. To me, it seemed like, I mean, I voted for Reform, and then after that, I thought, I'm not sure I can vote for that party because the one person that was really representing me with his views on Twitter and so on was Rupert Lowe, and then they get rid of that guy. So I'm like, oh, so it's kind of an affront to me and to the voters who likes Rupert Lowe. But is it interesting that that hasn't cut through at all in the local elections, and they've absolutely smashed it anyway? What do you make of that?
Oh, that's my point. That's why is that if Rupert Lowe had been in charge of reform, they'd have
Oh,
done
sorry. Yeah.
very well. they just struck an accord with the people. The people are at this kind of really, in a way, I think, quite beautiful sense of rebellion using democracy to tell the elites, as I say, in different names, uni party, two sides of the same coin, all of that. They're willing to tell them, you have failed us dismally, and we've had enough. So I think what would be interesting to see is not what's going to happen now, and I do still want to see reform succeed because there's no other movement out there or political party, and that the other main political parties need to be taught a lesson. They need to be brought to heel to the feet of the people of this country. But if Rupert Lowe, others join together, I think that'll be interesting then of whether members would bring reform or those people like yourself who voted for him would actually say now is the time to join that side, the kind of community of individuals that have a different view, a different slant, a much more kind of cohesive, honest view, and culturally they're different to reform. Now, will that in the initial stages create a problem at the polling? Would it divide communities and allow the others to get through potentially? And there is always that difficulty, but it's how they go about it. But those individuals like you that voted for reform and didn't feel that they've been let down, I think something's coming that will be there for yourselves. The question is whether what is coming then either sits and waits or has immediate impact. To my extent, I think there's going to be some immediate impact, but whether they can get that growth against reform at this stage while they're doing so well will be more difficult. We know what British politics is like.
Yeah. All right. Interesting. So, just lastly on the Tories, then, since I brought them up, can the Tories recover, or are they dead, as Dominic Cummings said they might be the other day?
I think Dominic Cummings has his finger on the button, and I think others are saying that after several hundred years, because they're not learning the lessons rapidly enough, because they are so in the doldrums that donors are leaving, people are moving to reform, they are really in the death knells. And it's that internal battle between the left wingers and liberals against those of the conservatives on the right, as they say it. That's how they divide it. But actually, until they make that decision, they will continue to fail. And they will going to have to lance the boil. They're going to have to really say, you lot go and join the Liberal Democrats because that's where you're more comfortable with. We're going to go out on our own and we're going to really attack uh, the country on the real areas where we believe is sovereignty, defending our history, lower taxation, uh, dealing internationally in the way that we have done before, not joining the European Union and fighting back in a way against Starmer orders, all of that. And if they can do that, they'll have a rump. And you never know with a history of the party that's got a rump, it may well be able to recover.
Hmm. Okay. And presumably that's with a generic rather than a Badenoch then.
I suspect it's the generic movement at the moment, that type of element. But I wouldn't dismiss necessarily Kemi. Kemi started off on that side of things, but has been dragged in my view, and dragged across to the left. And so, because of the power of the left in Conservative Central Office, and those who are the patrons of the Conservative Party who haven't learned.
Hmm.
But I do feel that there is a room for people like her on the right because she does have the instincts who could join Suella Braverman and Liz Truss and others. It's the question of whether those who are just not there, not getting it yet, whether they really want to stay or are they simply staying because it's a nice job as an MP. If they are, then they should get out and make way for those who really want to make the change.
Okay. And while we're on this last party political question, can Starmer and the Labour Party recover? Because I mean, there is a theory among some people, some of my friends even, that Labour could actually be more effective than Reform in a weird way because they're in there, they understand the levers of power. Once Starmer latches onto something, he's like a shark, and if he really latched onto immigration, perhaps he could fix it, and perhaps Farage is all slogans. So if they do a couple of things, they got the India trade deal, the US trade deal. If he actually does something about immigration, so could Labour recover, or are they going to lose to Reform at this stage?
I think at the next stage they are going to lose heavily to Reform, and let's just be frank about that. Politics also is an element of clans, community, and you can see that in Wales. Uh, for absolutely decades upon decades, they would say, "I'm voting Labour because my mum voted Labour, my granddad voted Labour." If you look at that now, whole communities are turning around and saying, "We're all voting Reform and we're kicking Labour out." That's really difficult to have gone from that movement of Labour to the movement of Reform in big areas of this country. It's not easy for Labour just to come back and say, "Hey, we fixed the borders overnight," when you've been part of the problem for the last 20 years, and there's a dishonesty element in there. People just don't trust them. Uh, can Labour recover? I do believe they do. They've got a much more um, stronger base in many ways than the Conservatives have at the moment, because they made a conscious decision under Blair and Brown that they were going to pursue um, richer individuals, those in the civil services and the kind of public sector, and university students. And as university students get older and get wealthier, they too will be able to sustain the power and money that's needed for Labour and the influence in business or across uh, community sectors. And when you look at polling now, isn't it really interesting that a vast majority of the A's and B's and the wealthiest people in this country are willing to vote Labour rather than the Conservative Party? So they have actually effectively become the Conservative Party in terms of the wealth, and those who are at the bottom end, the D's, E's, and C's, have gone for Reform and the Conservative Party. It's an enormous change in our lifetime, certainly in my lifetime, to see that. And so, because they've got the money, the power, and the university base, and they also want to try and open the door to more immigrants, which they see as initially voting for them, although we know over time they change, they have an opportunity to do so. And I think the way that they'll do that is something similar to what you said. It's that they will try and now be doers, say, "We've achieved things. Look what we've actually done." We'll start by saying we've done deals with India and America and now the European Union. I don't think people really will see any of that as a cut through at this stage. And I think also, as a side issue, that all political leaders, when they get into serious trouble, go for a war or try to look like a diplomat or a statesman across the globe. He's gone early on that front. There's no opportunity for him to come back when it gets even worse, particularly if next year he loses so badly in Wales. So there is a chance, but they will have to be doers and do it properly. That's just not in the nature of the Labour Party to be doers on areas on the right. They're much happier spending money and saying, "Look how much we spent on the NHS and education, whatever." Fixing potholes is boring, but that's a doing action. It costs money. Removing net zero, no way are they going to do that. So they could do it. There's a gap. They have the population, but then lost the communities at the moment across the country.
Yeah, and maybe that brings us to immigration, which is obviously one of your expert areas, because Starmer says he'll fix it on the one hand, and on the other, he says he won't leave the ECHR. And I was watching, I was watching Dominic Cummings in his Sky interview, and he was saying it was just the political will that's needed to stop the boats. He said this a lot. It's simply about getting out of the ECHR and so on, and it's just that they won't do it, but they could do it. So how do we stop the boats? I mean, is it just about getting out of the ECHR, or is it more complex?
Uh, yes, it is a little bit more complex. Dominic is correct. It is all about political will, and it's all about the strength of not just the leader of the country, the prime minister, but it's how he backs his ministers to deal with what I got. I was thinking it was Matthew Elliott, but it's not. It's Alistair from the Telegraph's called termed the blob.
Alistair Heath.
Alistair Heath, and they are uncomfortable on what I regard, having spoken to many of them, on three particular fronts. The first is a Foreign Office issue. They do not feel that they should be in a position where some of the decisions would impact negatively our relationships with the European Union, and in particular France. And that would be one of the key points, is actually turning the boats back and using the laws that we have or treaties, or indeed the strength of our own political and soft power on the France to say we're going to do it anyway. So Foreign Office wouldn't want to do that. Treasury terms, they do not like the idea of turning the boats back and controlling it because it moves into the narrative of controlling immigration, which for many, many years has been a shibboleth for them of GDP growth. However, in questions that were raised to the Prime Minister in his speech about immigration, he did accept that under questioning that growth has been tested in the past few years and failed, caused by mass immigration. That's a major, major step forward. Not many people have picked up on that. And that's significant for the first prime minister in my known time since Blair to have actually admitted that. And I suppose the third is an international issue, being a naturalized international lawyer with those who within the party really are loath to challenge international law. The idea that we're going back to being Belarus or Russia if we leave the ECHR is so significant within the Labour movement because it's all about internationalism and it's about the extension of the political belief of socialism and not the nation state. So they've got three major challenges to be able to achieve that. But Dominic Cummings is right. If you've got the will, you can do so. You can do so by, first of all, closing the borders and dealing with France. We'll push them back. I'm sorry. And if you don't like it, we'll nationalize one of the water companies that you own. Simple as that. Or anyone to deal with BNP Paribas, with all the housing that BNP Paribas owns across for rental for your pension fund companies, we'll nationalize them. See, strength with a potential issue. Make the French back down in terms of that. That would be incredibly difficult, but with political will, you could do so. Leaving the European Courts of Human Rights, leaving the Human Rights Act, bringing in our own Bill of Rights, transforming the immigration regulations to prevent indefinite right to remain for almost 60% of asylum applicants on a discretionary basis rather than falling under categories of ECHR or the United Nations Asylum and Refugee rules. That takes political will. And you remove them. Deportations, absolutely key, not just with criminals, but illegal migrants who failed asylum, which would mean having to go to countries and saying, you either accept them back, otherwise, then we'll have to stop all forms of benefits going to your country. We will utilize anti-money laundering regulations and sanctions against you. Okay, not it wouldn't necessarily work about those who've left Iran, but it certainly would work with Iraq. It certainly would work with Pakistan, certainly would work with India and other African countries as well. So it's about political will, and there's a whole series of things that can click in from legislation on primary law to international rules to being determinative to having procedures like Rwanda in place as well. They could kick in fairly quickly. And the model for that is really what Stephen Miller did in preparation of Trump regaining power. How quickly did all the rules, laws, changes, and policy procedures occur in the United States within days? And that's because Stephen Miller, as the architect of all the closing the borders, putting the walls up, returning the illegals, had prepared this for 5 years and understood, because of the way they'd failed in previous times under Trump, how they were going to utilize all of this against the system.
Hmm.
And even whilst there's cases being taken to court in the United States, they're winning there as well. So it's preparation and will, but it can be done.
With that in mind, are you confident that reform could get it done? Because one of the big disadvantages they have is they're not used to power. Trump, as you say, had a second crack at it, so he was ready to hit the ground running. But would reform just be swamped by the blob and not understanding the mechanisms of power? And would they actually get things done, do you think?
This is why I raised the massive concern at the beginning about whether Nigel has the will and the desire to go up against the elites? Is he just simply there saying, well, I'm unhappy that I've not been a clubbable individual for all of my life, so I fought against you, but now I'm in, I'm willing up to stand up against the 10, 12 permanent secretaries who are willing to stand against me? Am I going to have capable ministers who understand the system when we don't? And when the civil service are running them round in circles, what can we do? And I don't see that. That's my problem.
Right.
I don't see him employing people with reform in organizations to create the next Stephen Miller. There are only a few of us who are on the right who really understand immigration to an nth degree and understand how to deal with senior civil servants and be able to battle against them. I don't see the Stephen Miller rising within reform for that. I don't see an equivalent of a Stephen Miller being able to deal with somebody that can take out the Quangos. Douglas Carswell wrote explicitly how you can use legislation before just as you've taken power to deal a blow to the civil servants. There's no one there that we can see. Now, of course, there may be a hidden group of bright individuals in a basement and reform filing away all of this technically and working on and firing out policies for us and preparing us without knowing. That may well be the case, but it's not the history and knowledge of any political party that ever been involved with Nigel Farage to have that in place. I remember when I was working with Susan Evans and Patrick O'Flynn, the huge battles we had to have over policy to create what was then regarded in 2015 as a damned good manifesto, monitored and checked. But bloody hell, were we fighting against like hidden walls within UKIP just to even get a sentence in certain documents? That is what I fear.
Yeah, so it's a question of will and a question of talent, and not squandering all the talent you have, which is Farage's kind of tendency. Yes, I mean I see Jemrick has some very talented young smart people, so that may be
Yes.
somewhere he can get an edge. But I haven't asked you about so-called legal immigration. I have to ask you about that. So, how do we cut that down, and what is the right number of people to come into the country?
Well, when I wrote a policy paper after Brexit called a Fair, Flexible, Forward Thinking Immigration Policy Paper, at that date with net migration just running over to 225, 230,000, it was capable to have a very good national health service, look after those in the farmers, have positive immigration in key areas of banking and health, and still have net migration of 50,000. So there are mechanisms in place in which we can do so by having defined visas. For example, in healthcare, that you can individual can come over, but you can't bring your family. You're here for 3 to 5 years, and then you have to return. The same applies with nurses. That's kind of policy that's adopted in the Middle East and works pretty well, and in other countries. You can have defined visas with individuals that can come over for short-term projects like farming, for example. They can also go. And then you do not allow family reunion as a big measure. You do not allow students to come over here for 3 to 5 years and being granted work visas, except in exceptional circumstances. Much of the system for assessing the visas and the amounts of people that could come into place uh, in the work environment through the Migration Advisory Committee was one of the key policies that I gave to UKIP, I gave to Vote Leave, I gave to Leave Means Leave, and others, including the Conservative Party afterwards. It is potentially a mechanism that could successfully work. The problem was that Boris and the people around him, particularly the civil servants, and I've heard a lot of the way that certain civil servants were pushing Boris on behalf of the large corporates, was that they allowed the Migration Advisory Committee just to expand numbers on universities because universities said, we'll go under, rather than saying, okay, if you're not going good enough, go under. That's it. I'm sorry. This is the marketplace. We're not going to actually keep feeding your universities to fund very wealthy chancellors. Look at the wage rises of chancellors since we've done this. You've exponentially gone through the roof. Halve your salary and keep some of your professors. It's QED. You're a business, but we're not going to just allow you to bring in more immigrants or students just to fill your pockets. That's what happened.
Hmm.
The same with the fallacy over care homes. We open the doors to visas for care homes, and we know through cases that have shown us about the frauds. But the fact is, you could get a care home visa, work there for a couple of months, and then leave and go and get another job elsewhere. That was obvious. Who in the Migration Advisory Committee, the Home Office, the visa sections, ignored that that would happen? And it was either done deliberately or negligently, or the people in place were just not good enough to be able to understand. That is a mistake. So you can do it by primarily restricting to short-term visas in certain areas, work with businesses to try and have a gauge around how many people should come. And on course, absolutely, of course, huge amounts of funding and looking at the wage structures of certain sectors. Why is it that people in care homes should be only on £15 an hour? Then look at the business model of care homes. Make them not pay VAT. Allow them to have reductions in taxation for the owners of the companies. Force larger wages. If we're going to put a minimum wage, why don't we say a minimum wage for a care home worker cleaning the bum is £30 an hour? That would certainly start encouraging more people to go and do the job.
Hmm. And what about the NHS? Because if you read things like The Independent, which I'm forced to sometimes in my job, um, they start screeching that, oh, immigration's coming down from 800,000 to 451,000. How are we going to cope with the NHS? They're implying that suddenly our NHS would collapse because of the lack of foreign workers, essentially.
Well, to be fair, there is an extent where we've gone from a period in 2017 to 19 when I was writing about this, where um, if we'd reduced the numbers dramatically, the National Health Service would not have collapsed in such a dramatic fashion. But two things have happened since then. The first is that we've had nearly 5 million people come into the country and remain here in that period of time. If we look over a 10-year period, it's nearly 10 million people. So the extensive requirements for health in this country through hospitals, care homes, and primary surgeries have just gone up in huge numbers, as well as the numbers of children, 600,000 on average each year belonging to non-UK citizens. So demand has increased. And as a consequence of that, so has our increase of population of people working within the NHS who are non-UK born citizens. And so it's like a Ponzi scheme. More people you bring in, the more people from foreign countries you've got to bring in. So unless you dramatically reduce net migration and also population by migration in this country, then there will be a short-term period. I think now it's going to be somewhere between 5 and maybe maximum 10 years, where the NHS will have some shortages in lots of areas. And that's where you use the visa system of the short-term scenario for us. If you want lots of Filipino nurses to come in, or as the moment that we're seeing lots of African nurses in certain areas, by all means allow them to come in on short-term visas, but no family. And they are clearly known at the beginning, you have no right to remain here after your 5 years or 3 years. So you learn about our country's medicine. We utilize you whilst we're training our own, whilst population is coming down. But at the same time, you can go back home and use those skills in your own country, which equally need them. So it's a positive on both sides. We are not stealing the talent from those countries, which no one ever seems to talk about. What about the home countries of Africans and Filipinos who are losing dedicated doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals out of their countries? It's a modern form of colonialism that we have. And I don't hear the Independent or the Guardian saying the NHS is a colonialist institution, of which it is in so many ways.
Yes, it's a sort of health version of the brain drain. And yeah, occasionally a Diane Abbott or someone will mention it, but yeah, it doesn't get talked about very much. That's a good point. Um, you mentioned the 5 million that have come in, and you did touch on deportations briefly, but I'm wondering, we hear a lot about the Boris wave, and I'm kind of wondering, A, why it happened, but B, can we do anything about it now that all these people are here? All right, that is the end of the free episode. But if you want the full podcast, go to nickdixon.net for all the extra content, all my articles. That is my Substack, nickdixon.net. And we need your help to keep this whole thing going, keep the lights on, this amazing production, hiring people, etc. nickdixon.net to support us. It's £5 a month, which is about the cost of some sort of fancy latte in London, or as a slight discount if you get the yearly option, or it's just £5 a month. So we'll see you on nickdixon.net, and thank you very much.